Before we start the video, comment where you are watching from, the time you are watching, and which story you like. My name is Frank Howard, and this is a story that still haunts me. It happened in 1976 in the Ozark National Forest, Arkansas. I was a park ranger then, with 20 years on the job. You'd think by that point I'd seen it all, but I was wrong. The Ozarks were my home, in a way. I knew every path, every creek, and the sounds of the woods better than I knew the back of my hand. But that year, something started to change. There were whispers around the ranger station about strange things happening on full moon nights. It wasn't the usual kind of wildlife drama we'd see bears knocking over trash cans or hikers getting lost. No, this was different. It was almost like something was hunting the people who came into the forest. It started small, like a missing camper here and there. People thought they'd gotten lost, or maybe attacked by a wild animal. But the stories didn't add up. The bodies that were found were torn apart, shredded, like an animal had gotten them, but the kind of damage wasn't like anything I had seen before. And then there were the sounds. On those full moon nights, the howling started. I'd been out there enough times to know the usual wildlife calls. This wasn't that. The howls had a rhythm, a kind of intelligence behind them. It was like they were calling to each other, waiting for something. Thomas, my partner, and I had been assigned to patrol the northern parts of the forest. He was a good guy, though he was a bit of a joker, always had a smile on his face, no matter what. But even he had started to notice it, the tension in the air. It felt like we were being watched. It was late September when we first came across something we couldn't explain. We were out on a routine patrol, checking some trails, when we found the first body. The poor guy had been torn apart. The tracks we found near him weren't like anything I'd seen. Big, clawed footprints way too large to be any bear. I can still picture it, the way the moonlight caught the blood on the rocks. The shadows felt like they were closing in on us, and I could hear Thomas whispering to himself, trying to keep his cool. But we both knew we weren't alone. Something else was out there with us. I didn't understand it at the time, but that was the beginning. Something ancient and dangerous had awakened in those woods, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. It was a full moon that night. You could feel it in the air, that strange kind of stillness. The forest was too quiet for comfort. Even the usual rustling of animals was missing. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Thomas and I were out there again, just the two of us, doing another round of patrol. We were used to the dark, used to the quiet. But tonight, something felt wrong. We'd found the body earlier, and I had a bad feeling that it wasn't going to be the last. We were heading back to the ranger station when we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, so far off that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, a chilling, bone-deep sound that made my hairs stand on end. Thomas looked at me, his face pale in the moonlight. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a low voice. I nodded. It wasn't just a wolf, it wasn't even a coyote, it was something else. The howls were different, almost, smarter. We kept walking, but the air felt heavier with each step. We were almost back to the station when we noticed something odd, fresh tracks leading off the trail. They were huge. We followed the tracks into the woods, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The trail led us deeper, further away from the main path. The air was thick, like it was holding on to something, like it was waiting. I could feel my heart picking up its pace. There was something about this that didn't sit right with me. Thomas seemed uneasy too, but he kept his usual calm, trying to joke through it. "Maybe it's just a big wolf, huh?" he said, trying to make light of it. But I could tell from the look in his eyes he didn't believe it either. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The tracks were too big to be any wolf. As we went further, the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual earthy scent of the woods. No, this smelled differentially, like something was rotting. My stomach twisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We came upon a clearing, and that's when we saw them. The first thing I noticed was the shape too large to be a regular animal. It was hunched low to the ground, its body covered in matted fur that shimmered in the moonlight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There were 3 of them, maybe more, moving slowly through the shadows. They were huge, easily 8 feet tall when they stood up. Thomas whispered, "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't even think straight. The creatures didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. They were like wolves, but they were walking upright, almost human in shape. Their eyes gleamed yellow in the darkness, and they moved silently, gliding through the trees like shadows. Before I could react, one of them lifted its head and stared right at us. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, like it was looking into me, seeing everything I was. And then, to my surprise, I heard a voice in my head. Not out loud, but inside my mind, like a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, looking at Thomas, but he didn't seem to hear it. He just kept staring at the creatures, frozen in place. I wanted to shout to warn him, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. The creature's gaze never left us, and the silence between us felt thick enough to choke on. "Leave now, or you will not leave at all." The voice was stronger this time, colder. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to leave Thomas behind. We were both rangers, trained for emergencies, trained to handle dangerous wildlife. But this wasn't anything normal. These things were something else, something old. Another howl echoed in the distance, closer this time. It was the same sound, but now it seemed to come from all directions, like the entire forest was alive with it. I turned to Thomas, desperate to snap him out of his trance. He was staring at the pack, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he were mesmerized. "Thomas," I said, shaking him, but it was no use. He didn't react. That's when I realized he wasn't just stunned. Something was wrong. It was like the creatures were pulling him in, changing him somehow. I stepped back, a cold realization hitting me like a punch. The creatures weren't just hunting us, they were trying to control us. I had heard stories before, old legends from the local Native American tribes about skinwalkers, creatures who could shapeshift, who could bend minds and control people. It wasn't something I had ever believed, but now, standing in that clearing with those creatures watching us, I started to think there might be truth to those old stories. Before I could act, Thomas took a slow step forward, as if he were in a trance. His eyes were glazed, his expression distant. I tried to call him back, but it was like he couldn't hear me anymore. I reached out, but before I could grab him, he turned and walked deeper into the forest, towards the pack. The pack leader, the largest one, stepped forward, its eyes never leaving mine. The voice came again, but this time it was louder, sharper, like a command. "He belongs to us now. Leave him or join him." I knew then that I had to make a choice. I couldn't let Thomas go, but I also couldn't fight these creatures, not alone. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop Thomas, especially if whatever magic they had was inside him now. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I needed to get back to the station. I needed help, but there was no time. Thomas was already too far gone, and if I didn't act fast, I might never see him again. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, watching Thomas walk toward the pack. Every part of me wanted to scream at him, to run after him, but something inside me told me that would only make things worse. I wasn't sure how much of Thomas was still there, or if he was completely gone. The creature, the leader, the one with the glowing yellow eyes, kept its gaze on me, watching my every move. Its presence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to turn around and run, but I couldn't. Something was stopping me. The air felt thick, almost like it was alive, like it was wrapping around me, keeping me trapped in place. That's when I remembered the old stories I'd heard when I first started as a ranger. They were just campfire tales back then, stories the locals told to scare the new guys. But now, standing in the moonlit woods, They felt all too real. Skinwalkers, creatures who could transform into animals, bend minds, control people. I didn't know if these things were skinwalkers, but they sure fit the description. I glanced at Thomas again. He was standing near the leader now, his face blank, his eyes distant. He wasn't fighting it anymore. He was one of them. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't leave him. Not like this. Taking a deep breath, I turned and started moving away from the clearing, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind raced, but I couldn't think straight. What could I do? I wasn't a damn wizard. I didn't know how to fight creatures like that, but I did know the forest. I knew the land, and I had to use that to my advantage. I made my way back the way we had come, as quietly as I could. But the further I went, the more I felt like something was watching me. It wasn't just the creatures, it was something deeper, like the whole forest was alive, breathing, waiting. The wind had picked up, and the trees seemed to whisper around me. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. I reached the old ranger station about an hour later. I knew it wasn't much, just a small cabin with a radio and some emergency supplies, but it was the only place I could think of. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me, my heart still pounding in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. I couldn't leave him, but I had no idea how to help him. I pulled out the old radio, hoping against hope that I could get a signal. It crackled to life, the static buzzing in my ears. But before I could even call for backup, a howl split the night air. It was so close now, too close. And it wasn't just one. There were dozens of them, echoing through the forest like a chorus of monsters. My hands shook as I held the radio, but I had to stay calm. I couldn't let fear control me now. I grabbed my rifle, checking the ammo, making sure I was ready for whatever came through that door. The howls grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were surrounding the station. I could hear them moving, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. And then, I heard something I didn't expect, a scratch at the door. It was slow at first, like something was testing the door. Then, harder, something or someone was trying to get in. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't fight them all. I wasn't even sure I could fight one. And I didn't know if I could shoot Thomas if it came to that. But I had no choice. If I didn't stop them, they would kill him. Or worse, they would turn him into whatever those creatures were. I heard another scratch, louder this time, followed by a low growl. I froze, holding my breath. I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay here much longer. I needed to act. But what could I do? I was alone, trapped with no backup. The only thing I could think of was to make a run for it. There was a small outpost to the east, about a 5-mile hike through thick woods. If I could get there, I might be able to call for help, but I couldn't leave the station unguarded. I couldn't just let them take it. The growling outside the door grew louder, and I knew I was running out of time. Whatever these things were, they weren't just animals. They were smart. They were patient. I made my decision. I couldn't wait around any longer. I had to get help. I grabbed my gear, checked the door one last time, and then bolted out the back, praying I could make it to the outpost before they caught up with me. I didn't waste any time. As soon as I stepped outside, I ran. The woods were dark, and the trail was hard to follow in the moonlight. But I knew it well enough to trust my feet. I could hear the creatures howling again, but this time it was closer, much closer. The sound echoed all around me, bouncing off the trees, making it feel like I was surrounded. I kept moving, my legs burning with every step, but I couldn't stop. I had to get to the outpost, or I was dead. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about Thomas, and everyone else who might be caught in this nightmare. Those things, whatever they were hunting us. And they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The wind howled through the trees, but it didn't drown out the sounds behind me. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs breaking under heavy feet. They were chasing me. I didn't need to look back to know that. I could feel their eyes on me, like they were closing in. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had no plan, no backup, just pure instinct driving me forward. The forest felt alive, twisting around me, trying to pull me in every direction. But I didn't let it. I focused on the one goal, the outpost. It was the only place where I could call for help. I just had to make it. My breath was coming fast and heavy. Sweat dripped down my face, but I kept pushing forward. And then, out of nowhere, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Pain shot through my ankle, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I could hear the growls getting closer. They were right behind me now. I tried to get up, but my ankle wouldn't hold. I gritted my teeth, panic creeping in. If I didn't get up now, they'd catch me. I forced myself to stand, but my leg buckled. I collapsed again, this time onto my hands and knees. I could hear the creatures coming closer, their steps slow, deliberate. They were savoring it. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was Thomas. He was standing there, just outside the tree line, watching me. His eyes were no longer blank, no longer distant. There was something else in them, now something darker. He wasn't the same person I had known. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out to him, to beg him to come back. But I knew it was too late. Whatever had taken hold of him wasn't Thomas anymore. He was just another part of this pack, this nightmare. The leader stepped into view behind him, its massive form emerging from the shadows. The moonlight caught its fur, making it look like some kind of nightmare creature, part man, part wolf. It stared at me, its yellow eyes gleaming, and I heard that voice again, cold and commanding in my mind. "You cannot stop us. You are already too late." I didn't know what else to do. I had to act. I couldn't let them get away with it. Not now, not after everything. I pulled my rifle from my shoulder and raised it, aiming directly at Thomas. I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice. I couldn't let him be part of whatever this was. I had to put an end to it before it spread. "Thomas!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry, buddy." I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the woods. For a split second, everything was still. And then I saw it. Thomas, his body jerking as the bullet hit him. He staggered back, a look of confusion crossing his face. His mouth opened, as if he was trying to speak, but no words came out. He merely looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. For a moment, I thought I might have made a mistake. Maybe, just maybe, I had killed my friend. But then I saw the change. The skin on his face seemed to ripple, shifting under his skin, and his eyes glowed yellow again. Whatever part of him was still human was gone. With a howl, Thomas lunged at me. I fired again, hitting him in the chest. But he didn't stop. He was more than just a man now. He was one of them. The leader, seeing me struggle, stepped forward. It wasn't just the pack anymore, it was me against all of them. The fear, the hopelessness. It was all crushing in on me. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. Not yet. The next moments were a blur of noise and chaos shots fired, howls filling the air, and me trying to fight back. But I was outnumbered, outmatched. I wasn't sure how I did it, but somehow I made it to my feet and kept moving, keeping the rifle between me and them. I didn't know how, but I broke free. I stumbled through the forest, my heart racing, not daring to look back. I knew they were close behind, but I couldn't let fear take over. I had to get to the outpost. I had to get help. I kept running, my breath coming in gasps, the sharp pain in my ankle fading to a dull throb. I didn't stop to look behind me, but I could hear the creatures, the howls, growing fainter as I pushed forward. I didn't know how far I'd gone or how much time had passed. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. If I stopped, they'd catch me. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. But it didn't offer much comfort. The woods felt endless, like they were trying to swallow me whole. Each step felt heavier, like the forest was closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that they were out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the outpost in the distance. It was small, just a rundown cabin with a radio tower sticking out of the roof. I was almost there. But as I neared it, I heard something behind me. A rustling, then a growl. My heart skipped a beat. They were close, too close. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw were trees. I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My legs were burning, my lungs aching, but I pushed through. I was so close. The door to the outpost was only a few steps away. I reached the door and yanked it open, slamming it behind me as I rushed inside. I locked it quickly, my hands shaking as I pressed my back against it. I could hear movement outside, the creatures circling, waiting. I didn't know how long the door would hold. I limped to the radio, trying to steady my breathing, my thoughts racing. I needed to call for backup. I had to warn someone, but the radio crackled to life, and I froze. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but then I heard it again, a voice, faint and distorted. "Frank. Frank, are you there?" My heart skipped a beat. The voice was Thomas's. I could hear the fear in it, the desperation, but it wasn't really him. I knew it. It was the pack's influence. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had to stay focused. I grabbed the microphone, my hands sweating as I tried to dial for help. My fingers were unsteady, but I managed to get a signal. "Mayday," I said. My voice shaky but firm. "This is Frank Howard, Ranger Station 3. I need backup. I'm under attack. It's not just wolves. There's something else out there. They're hunting us." There was a long pause, and then a crackle of static before the voice on the other end responded. "Copy that, Ranger Howard. Help is on the way. Stay put." I didn't know how long it would take for help to arrive. It could be hours, maybe longer. But for the first time since all this started, I felt a tiny spark of hope. I sat down, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I thought about Thomas. I thought about what I had to do. I had to get back. I couldn't leave him out there. But part of me wondered if it was already too late. Maybe the man I had known was gone for good. Maybe the creatures had taken him completely. The growls outside grew louder. They were still out there, circling, waiting. They were patient, and they knew I couldn't stay in that outpost forever. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I had to hold on. I checked my rifle again, making sure it was loaded. I wasn't sure what I would do if they got inside, but I had to try. I couldn't let them win. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I stayed close to the door, listening for any sound, any movement. My mind was racing, but I tried to push the thoughts of Thomas out of my head. There was nothing I could do for him now, not unless I could get help. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the sound I had been waiting for, the distant hum of a helicopter. It was far off, but it was coming closer. The cavalry was finally on its way. I didn't know if I would make it out of this alive, but I was holding on. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for me to save Thomas. I wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. The sound of the helicopter kept getting closer, but the creatures outside didn't seem to care. They were still there, still circling the outpost, their growls echoing through the woods. It felt like the walls were closing in. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I kept my grip on the rifle. I couldn't let them get in. Not now, not when help was so close. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the growls, it wasn't the howls, it was the voice. "Frank? Frank, can you hear me?" It was Thomas. His voice came through the radio again, clear this time, almost like he was standing right next to me. I flinched, gripping the radio tighter. His voice wasn't full of rage like before, it was soft, almost pleading. "Thomas?" My voice barely escaped my throat. "Is that really you?" There was a long pause. Then he spoke again, his words slow and unsure. "Please, help me. They won't stop. They're taking me." I swallowed hard, trying to control my breath. My mind was racing. Was it really him? Or was it just another trick, another part of their game? But the voice sounded real. It sounded like Thomas. And in that moment, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe I could save him. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where are you, buddy?" He didn't answer at first. Then I heard him again. This time, quieter, almost like a whisper. "By the old oak tree, near the clearing." I froze. The old oak tree. The clearing. It was the place we had been earlier, the same place where I had shot him, where everything had gone wrong. "Thomas, you've got to fight it," I shouted into the radio. "You have to fight whatever's controlling you. Please, man, hold on." There was silence on the other end. I wasn't sure if he could hear me or if he was even still there. The growling outside was louder now, closer. I could hear them moving around the cabin, and I knew they wouldn't wait much longer. I had a choice to make. I could stay here and wait for the helicopter to arrive, but I didn't think I had much time. Or I could go back into the woods and try to find Thomas to save him, even if it meant risking my life. I couldn't just leave him out there. I couldn't live with that. I grabbed my gear, checked my rifle one last time, and stepped away from the door. I was going after him. The night felt different now, the air thick with tension. The forest was alive with the sounds of creatures moving in the dark. But there was something else, too, a feeling of being hunted. I made my way back toward the clearing, trying to stay low and quiet. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Every step I took felt like a risk. The creatures could be anywhere. They could be watching me right now. When I reached the clearing, I didn't see anything at first. The old oak tree stood tall and silent in the center of the space, its branches twisted and bare. The air felt colder here, heavier, like it was holding its breath. Then I saw him. Thomas was standing by the tree, his back turned to me. He looked different. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His eyes were glowing again, that same yellow light that I had seen earlier. He didn't turn around when he heard me approach. "Thomas," I called, my voice desperate. "Thomas, it's me. It's Frank. I'm here to help you. Please, buddy, fight it." He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me. But then, slowly, he turned around. His face was pale, his eyes filled with fear. It wasn't the Thomas I had known. It was someone else, something else. "You can't save me, Frank," he said, his voice sounding distant, like it wasn't even him anymore. "It's too late. They have me now." I stepped back, the weight of his words hitting me hard. The man I had known, the man I had worked beside for years, was gone. All that was left was a shell, a puppet controlled by something far worse. I raised my rifle, aiming at the creature that was once my friend. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I couldn't hesitate. "I'm sorry, Thomas," I whispered, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed through the clearing. Thomas fell to the ground, his body twitching for a moment before going still. The creatures in the woods howled in fury, their anger boiling over. They had lost their hold on him. But it wasn't over yet. They were still out there, and they were still coming. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just had to keep moving, get back to the outpost, and wait for help to arrive. The howls grew fainter as I ran, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was going to make it out alive. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time that night, I felt like I had a chance. I ran back through the woods, my heart thumping in my chest. The pain in my ankle was almost unbearable, but I pushed through it. I couldn't stop now, not after everything I had been through. The outpost was close, just a few more minutes, and I'd be safe. The sounds of the forest had changed. The howls were farther away now, almost like they had lost interest. But I wasn't foolish enough to think I was out of danger. Those creatures were still out there, and they would keep hunting until they had what they wanted. When I finally reached the outpost, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it quickly. My hands were shaking, and I had to steady myself for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The helicopter was getting closer. I could hear the hum of the blades cutting through the air. Help was on the way. But even as I stood there, safe for the moment, I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. The look in his eyes before I had to pull the trigger, it haunted me. Was he still in there somewhere? Or had he been lost forever the moment he stepped into that clearing? I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, my rifle still clutched tightly in my hands. I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't know how long I sat there waiting for the helicopter to arrive. The silence in the outpost was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the unmistakable whir of the helicopter's blades overhead. My heart lifted at the sound. Help was here. I stumbled to my feet, making my way outside just as the helicopter touched down. The crew rushed toward me, their faces filled with concern. One of them, a medic, checked me over quickly, making sure I was all right. "You look like you've been through hell," the medic said, his voice sympathetic but firm. "We'll get you patched up." I nodded, too tired to say anything. My mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. But it didn't make sense. It couldn't. How could any of it be real? I was led into the helicopter, and as we took off, I looked back at the forest below. The trees were dark, silent now, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew what had been out there, what I had faced. We flew in silence for a while, the only sound the whir of the blades and the hum of the engines. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but my thoughts wouldn't stop. I kept thinking about Thomas, about what he had become and what I had done. I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive myself for it. Eventually, the pilot spoke up, breaking the silence. "We've got word from the Rangers back at headquarters," he said. "They're sending a team to sweep the area, but it sounds like it's been contained. We'll get to the bottom of this. Don't worry." I didn't know if I should be relieved or more terrified. The thought that I had just experienced something so unreal made my stomach turn. But for now, there was nothing I could do but trust that they would handle it. As we flew toward the nearest town, I closed my eyes, trying to block out the images of the night. But they kept coming, Thomas, the creatures, the howls. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. When we landed, the paramedics took over. They checked me out, patched up my ankle, and got me into a hospital. The whole time I felt like I was in a fog, disconnected from everything. My mind kept returning to that clearing, to the faces of the creatures, to the moment I had had to pull the trigger. It wasn't until later that night, after I had been given a bed and some time to rest, that I realized something. Something that had been nagging at me since I first shot Thomas. I didn't hear the howls anymore, but I could feel them. Deep inside, like they were still out there, like they were still watching. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was ever truly safe. The next morning, when the police and the ranger teams came in to talk to me, I told them everything about Thomas, the creatures, the strange magic they seemed to possess. But they didn't believe me. They thought I had gone through something traumatic and that my mind was playing tricks. They dismissed it as a series of wild animal attacks. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had faced. I retired soon after that, unable to shake the feeling that the forest would always be a part of me now. And even now, as I sit here writing this, I hear something in the distance, a howl on the wind, soft but unmistakable. Maybe I'm just hearing things, but then again, maybe I'm not. All I know is that I'll never be the same, and I'll never forget what happened in the Ozark National Forest. My name is Maria Rodriguez, and this happened to me back in 1983. I was a ranger and an experienced tracker working in Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I loved my job. It was peaceful, simple, and I knew every inch of those woods like the back of my hand. Or at least, I thought I did. It all started when a couple of hikers reported something strange. They said they'd seen a massive shadow moving between the trees. One man claimed it was over 10 feet tall. Another said it just disappeared into thin air. Most of the time, people exaggerate or get scared of bears. But this time felt different. The hikers weren't just scared, they were terrified. Their eyes had that look, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. I didn't believe in ghost stories or monsters, but I did believe in my duty as a ranger. If something or someone was out there scaring people, I needed to check it out. So I grabbed my gear, packed enough food and water, and took my tracking dog, Buddy, with me. Buddy was the best partner I could ask for, loyal, sharp, and fearless. The morning was calm when we started. The forest stretched out in front of us, quiet except for the rustling leaves and chirping birds. The sun's rays cut through the tall pine trees, but something felt off. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. You might not think much of silence, but for a ranger, it's a warning. No birds, no animals, just stillness. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. Buddy noticed it too. His ears perked up, and he stayed close to my side, growling softly. I patted his head to calm him down, but honestly, I was trying to calm myself down too. That's when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. On the forest floor, I saw footprints, huge ones. They were at least 3 times the size of my boot, with deep impressions, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I crouched down to take a closer look. "No way," I whispered. These weren't bear tracks. They looked almost human, except for how big and wide they were. Buddy started barking suddenly, his nose pointing into the thick trees ahead. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, the feeling you get when someone's watching you. "Easy, Buddy," I whispered, gripping his leash. For a long minute I just stood there listening. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, but my gut told me something was out there. Something I couldn't see. I shook it off. Maybe I was letting the hikers' stories get to me. "Let's keep moving," I told Buddy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And I was right. Buddy and I kept moving deeper into the forest. The footprints led us forward, but the deeper we went, the stranger everything felt. It wasn't just quiet now, it was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I tried to act calm, like I wasn't worried, but my hand stayed close to the small hunting knife on my belt. Buddy stayed close, too. He wasn't barking anymore, but his nose was working overtime, sniffing the air, like he could smell something I couldn't. Then we saw the first real sign. A tree, about 20 feet tall, had claw marks running down its bark, deep, rough gashes that cut straight through to the wood underneath. I ran my fingers over them. "No bear did this," I mumbled to myself. I'd seen bear scratches before. These were different, bigger, and spread wider apart. Buddy let out a low growl, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" I turned my head to follow his gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, just past the line of trees, there was something huge standing between the pines. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, like a trick of the light, but then it moved. It stepped forward. I froze. The thing was massive. It had to be at least 10 or 11 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung low at its sides. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, but its face, it wasn't a bear's face. It looked almost humanly bigger, rougher, and darker. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I could feel them on me, watching. Buddy barked like crazy, lunging against his leash. I grabbed his collar, trying to pull him back. "Hey, quiet, Buddy, quiet!" My voice was low, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature tilted its head, like it was studying us. Then, before I could move, it let out this sound, a deep, rumbling growl that turned into a roar so loud, it shook the ground beneath my feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. It was like the roar went straight into my chest and locked me in place. My body froze stiff like I was paralyzed. Buddy yelped and dropped to the ground beside me, whining like he was in pain. I don't know how long we stood there, staring, the creature roaring, Buddy whimpering at my feet. But then, just like that, it stopped. When I blinked, the thing was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, the space where it stood was empty. Nothing but trees and shadows. I fell to my knees, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold Buddy's leash. He crawled over to me, pressing his body against mine, still trembling. What was that?" I whispered to myself. My voice sounded so small, like it didn't belong to me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. It was like the forest had swallowed the creature whole. "Come on, Buddy," I said finally, pulling myself to my feet. "We're getting out of here." I turned back the way we'd come, walking fast, almost running. My mind was racing. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't alone in these woods. And whatever that thing was, it was watching us. I don't know how long it took us to get back to my truck. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder. Buddy was right at my side, ears flat, tail low. Whatever that thing was, it had rattled both of us. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip below the trees. The shadows stretched long across the ground, making everything look darker. I opened the truck door, and Buddy jumped in without a second thought. He curled up on the seat, still shaking a little. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself down. I had seen a lot of things as a ranger bears, mountain lions, even illegal hunters, but I'd never seen anything like that. My mind kept going back to the roar, that paralyzing, gut-twisting sound that had locked me in place. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. I should have driven home right then. I should have called it a day, reported it to my supervisor, and let someone else deal with it. But I couldn't. I had to know what it was. What if it was dangerous? What if it hurt someone? Just one more look, I told myself. I grabbed my flashlight, my rifle just in case, and made sure Buddy stayed in the truck. "Stay here, boy. You're not coming this time." He whined a little but didn't try to follow me. I locked the doors behind me and started back toward the forest. This time, the air felt heavier. It's hard to explain, but it was like the forest knew I was coming back. The quiet was deeper, the shadows darker. My flashlight cut through the gloom, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Every step I took, the feeling of being watched got stronger. It didn't take me long to find the tracks again. Huge footprints, leading deeper into the trees. I followed them, moving slow, careful with every step. Then I found the cave. It was tucked into the side of a hill, hidden behind a thick wall of brush. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it completely. The entrance was wide, maybe 10 feet across, and it disappeared into pitch blackness. A smell hit me. As I got closer, something rotten, like old meat left out in the sun. I swallowed hard, shining my light inside. Bones. They were scattered everywhere. Piles of the animal bones, mostly deer and smaller game. But some were bigger, too big. I couldn't let myself think about what they might be. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam landing on the far wall. There were marking strange shapes and symbols carved into the stone. They didn't look random. They looked old, like they'd been there for centuries. My heart was pounding in my chest as I moved the light across the walls, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it. A deep rumbling sound coming from the back of the cave. It was low at first, like distant thunder, but it got louder, closer. The same sound I'd heard earlier, the one that had frozen me in place. I felt it in my bones, in my chest. The fear came back thick and heavy, and I couldn't move. Then I heard something else. A sharp snap behind me, like a branch breaking. I turned fast, my flashlight shaking in my hand. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the trees and darkness. but then something moved right at the edge of the light. A shape, a shadow. It stepped closer, and the light caught it just enough to see the outline of tall, massive, and watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was the same thing I'd seen before. My heart was hammering, and my legs screamed at me to run. I didn't wait. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the brush, stumbling over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps, thud, 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 like something huge was following me. It didn't roar this time. It didn't need to. I knew it was there. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I didn't stop. I ran straight to the truck, flung the door open, and jumped in. Buddy was barking like crazy, clawing at the window, but I didn't look back. I started the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as I peeled out of there. I didn't slow down until I was miles away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the clock, Buddy curled up at my feet. I kept seeing those bones, those markings, and that thing standing just out of reach of the light. I knew I couldn't leave it alone. Something was out there, something dangerous, and it wasn't going to stop. The next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cave, the bones, and that massive shadow watching me from the trees. Buddy stayed close, never leaving my side, like he knew something was wrong. I called in sick to work, but I wasn't planning to rest. I needed answers. I grabbed my keys, gave Buddy a pat on the head, and drove to a small village about 30 minutes away. There was a local tribe that had lived near Pisgah National Forest for generations, and I hoped someone there could help me understand what I'd seen. The drive felt longer than usual. I kept replaying the night before in my head, the roar, the footprints, the feeling of being hunted. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every thought. "Get it together, Maria," I muttered to myself. When I got to the village, I parked and asked around for someone who knew the forest well. People pointed me toward an elder named Samuel Blackfeather. I found him sitting outside his small cabin, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as I approached, his eyes sharp and knowing, like he could tell I was troubled before I even said a word. "Morning," I said quietly. "You're Samuel Blackfeather, right?" He nodded slowly. "I am. And you're the ranger who went into the woods." I froze. How did he know that? How did you? "You're not the first to come here after seeing something you shouldn't have." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words that made me uneasy. He gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Sit down." I sat, feeling my heart start to race again. "I need to know," I said finally. "There's something out there, something big. I saw it. It disappeared right in front of me. I heard it roar, and I couldn't move. I found a cave, and," I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the bones and the markings. "It's not normal." Samuel didn't look surprised. He set down his carving and sighed, staring out at the horizon like he was remembering something. "You saw the guardian spirit," he said softly. "Guardian spirit?" I asked. He nodded. "A long time ago, that part of the forest was sacred. It was home to our ancestors' burial grounds. The spirit was created to protect those lands and keep outsiders away. It was powerful, yes, but it was also peaceful. It didn't harm anyone unless it had to." I swallowed hard. That thing wasn't peaceful. Samuel turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time I saw sadness in his eyes. "No, it's not peaceful anymore. Over time, the land was disturbed. People built trails, hunted in the wrong places, and ignored the warnings. The spirit, it became corrupt. It still protects the land, but now it doesn't see the difference between a threat and an innocent person." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So you're saying it kills people?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He just nodded. "Those who get too close don't come back." I thought about the cave, the bones, the claw marks on the trees. My stomach turned. How do we stop it? Samuel's face grew even more serious. "You don't stop it. You can't kill it. It's not a living thing, it's a spirit, bound to the land. But there is a way to send it back into sleep. How? I asked quickly. He stood up and went inside his cabin, returning with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently in my hands. This is a ritual bundle. You must take it to the cave you found. There are markings on the walls, aren't there? I nodded. Yes. Those markings are part of the spirit's bond. You must light a fire inside the cave and perform the ritual to calm the guardian. But be warned, it won't let you do this easily. It will fight back. I stared at the bundle, my hands trembling slightly. And what happens if I fail? Samuel looked at me with a kind of quiet pity. Then it will kill you, just like it killed the others. I didn't ask who the others were. I didn't want to know. I stood up, my heart pounding. Thank you, Samuel. Be careful, he said, his voice low. The spirit knows when someone is coming for it. It will be waiting. I nodded and walked back to my truck, the ritual bundle clutched tightly in my hand. As I sat down in the driver's seat, I took a deep breath and looked out at the forest in the distance. The calm trees and rolling hills looked peaceful from here, but I knew the truth. Something terrible was waiting for me out there, and I had no choice but to go back. By the time I got back to the forest, the sky was gray and the sun was sinking lower. I parked at the same trailhead where it all started. The place felt different now, heavier, darker, like the forest knew what I was about to do. I opened the truck door, and Buddy jumped out before I could stop him. No, Buddy, I said firmly, kneeling down to grab his collar. You're staying here. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes and let out a low whine. But I couldn't take him with me. I didn't want him to get hurt. I scratched behind his ears and pointed back to the truck. Stay. I'll be back. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I said it anyway. I slung my bag over my shoulder and pulled the ritual bundle out. It felt small and fragile in my hands, but Samuel's words echoed in my head. It will fight back. Taking one last deep breath, I stepped onto the trail and started walking. The forest was quiet, again too quiet. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the trees were watching me. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear were my own footsteps crunching on the leaves. I gripped my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows in front of me. I tried not to think about the cave, or the bones, or that massive figure I'd seen. But my mind kept going there, over and over again. My stomach twisted with every step. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the hill. The cave entrance was still there, just as I'd left it, wide and dark, like a giant mouth waiting to swallow me whole. That awful smell hit me again, rotting and sour, making me gag. I pulled my scarf up over my nose, but it didn't help much. I shined my flashlight into the cave. The beam barely scratched the surface of the darkness. You've got this, I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded small and weak. I stepped inside. The air in the cave was thick and cold. My footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and the farther I went, the worse the smell got. I kept the flashlight pointed straight ahead, the beam shaking slightly in my hand. The bones were still there, scattered around me. I tried not to look at them. I just focused on moving forward. When I reached the far wall, I saw the markings again. Up close, they looked even stranger: circles, sharp lines, and symbols that seemed to twist when I looked at them too long. I set my bag down and pulled out the ritual bundle Samuel had given me. Okay, I whispered. Just light the fire, do the ritual, and get out of here. I started unpacking. Inside the bundle were small sticks of wood, herbs tied with string, and a flint to start a fire. My hands were shaking as I placed everything carefully in the center of the cave floor. I grabbed the flint and struck it over and over again until a small flame flickered to life. The fire grew slowly, crackling in the darkness. The light danced across the walls, and for a moment, I felt a small sense of relief. But that feeling didn't last long. I heard it again, a deep rumbling growl. I froze, staring into the darkness at the back of the cave. The sound grew louder, like thunder rolling closer. My chest tightened, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave now. "Focus," I whispered, my voice shaking. I reached into the bundle and grabbed the small pouch of herbs. Samuel had told me to throw them into the fire and speak the words he'd written down for me. My hands trembled as I held the pouch over the flames. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, darker than the cave itself, slid across the wall. It was huge, taking shape right in front of me. My breath caught in my throat. The creature stepped forward. I could see it now, those long arms, its massive body, the fur that seemed to shift like smoke. Its face was just a blur, but I could feel its eyes. They burned through me, heavy and angry. It let out a roar that shook the cave walls. The sound hit me like a wave, freezing me in place. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to black out. "Move, Maria!" I screamed at myself inside my head. Somehow, I managed to tear open the pouch of herbs and throw them into the fire. The flames turned blue, flickering wildly and casting strange shadows on the walls. I grabbed the small piece of paper Samuel had given me and started reading the words out loud. The language was old and strange, and my voice shook as I spoke, but I kept going. The creature roared again, louder this time, and I felt the ground tremble under me. It took another step forward, its shadow stretching over me like a dark cloud. I could feel its anger, its hunger. The fire flared brighter. The markings on the walls began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, until the whole cave was bathed in a strange bluish light. The creature let out a screech, an awful piercing sound that made my ears ring. It didn't like this. I kept reading, my voice growing louder. The air in the cave felt electric, like a storm was building all around me. I could see the creature's form flickering, like it was struggling to stay solid. "Go back," I shouted the final words, my voice cracking. The fire roared up, shooting toward the ceiling in a blast of blue light. The creature let out one final roar, a sound so loud and deep, I thought my chest would split open. Then it was gone. The fire died down to a flicker, and the cave fell silent. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath. My body felt heavy, like I'd just run a marathon, but the air felt lighter. The weight I'd felt all night was gone. I looked around the cave, the blue glow from the markings fading back into darkness. The creature, whatever it was gone. But something was wrong. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. I couldn't see the fire anymore. I couldn't see anything. "Wait," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. I waved my hand in front of my face, but I couldn't see it. I was blind. I don't remember how I got out of that cave. The moment I realized I couldn't see, panic hit me like a train. My heart raced, my breathing turned quick and shallow, and I crawled forward on my hands and knees, desperate to find the cave entrance. My fingers scraped against cold stone and loose bones, but I didn't stop. I just kept moving, trying not to scream. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. "You can do this. You can get out." I felt the air change as I crawled. It got colder, fresher. I knew I was close to the entrance. My hand finally hit dirt instead of stone, and I pulled myself out of the cave, gasping for air. The cool breeze touched my face, but everything around me was just black. "Buddy," I called out, my voice trembling. "Buddy." I heard a faint bark in the distance. Relief washed over me like a wave. At least he was still there. I sat there on the ground, my body shaking, trying to calm down. I rubbed my eyes over and over, hoping my vision would come back, but it didn't. The darkness stayed. I didn't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours. My head was spinning, my mind trying to process everything that had happened. The fire, the creature, the roar, it was all gone now. The forest felt quiet again, peaceful even, but I wasn't the same. Eventually, I heard footsteps running toward me. "Maria! Maria!" It was one of the other rangers, Ben. I recognized his voice right away. I could hear the gravel crunching under his boots as he got closer. "Maria, are you okay?" My voice caught in my throat. "I can't see, Ben. I can't see anything." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "What happened? What do you mean you can't see?" I tried to explain it to him as he helped me to my feet. I told him about the cave, the fire, the shadow, and the ritual. I could tell he didn't believe Minnow completely, but he didn't say so. He just let me lean on him as he guided me back toward the truck. When we got there, Buddy jumped up on me, barking and whining like crazy. I dropped to my knees and hugged him tight, feeling his fur under my hands. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if that was true. Ben helped me into the passenger seat, and I leaned back, feeling completely drained. "You need to see a doctor," he said softly. "Yeah," I mumbled. "But it's over now, right? It's gone?" There was silence. I turned my head toward where I thought Ben was, waiting for an answer. Finally, he said, "I don't know, Maria. Let's just get you out of here." The ride back was quiet. Buddy sat in my lap, his head resting against my chest, and I felt every bump in the road. The darkness was still there, wrapping around me like a blanket. It was strange I couldn't see, but I could still feel the forest, like it was somehow watching me even now. The doctors couldn't explain what happened. They ran tests, shined lights in my eyes, asked me 100 questions, but they had no answers. My eyes were fine, perfect, but my vision never came back. Word spread quickly among the rangers. Some believed me, others didn't. They called what I'd seen a bear or a trick of the light. But I knew the truth. Samuel Blackfeather knew the truth too. A week later, he came to visit me. I was sitting on my porch, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, when I heard his footsteps. Buddy growled at first, but I calmed him down. Samuel sat down beside me without saying a word. For a while, we just sat there in silence. Finally, I asked, "Is it really gone?" He let out a slow breath before answering, "For now." I frowned, my fingers brushing Buddy's fur. But I stopped it. I did the ritual. "You did," Samuel said gently. "You sent it back to sleep. But spirits like that, they don't disappear forever. They're part of the land. If people forget again, if the forest is disturbed, will return." His words sent a chill down my spine. So what was the point then? Samuel paused for a moment before answering. "You protected the forest, Maria, and you saved lives. But everything has a price." I didn't respond. I just sat there, feeling the cool breeze against my face, listening to the leaves rustle in the wind. I never went back to that cave. I never worked as a ranger again either. It wasn't just the blindness. I couldn't go near that forest without feeling it watching me. I could still hear the roar sometimes, echoing in my dreams, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, gripping the sheets. People still go missing in Pisgah National Forest from time to time. They call it accidents, wild animals, or getting lost, but I know better. Something's out there. It's always been out there, and I don't think it's ever really gone. My name is Jack Peterson, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me 33 years ago, back in 1991. It's something I never wanted to talk about. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, but some things just don't leave you. I was a senior ranger at White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, with retirement right around the corner. 40 years on the job, and I thought I'd seen everything: lost hikers, wild animals, freak storms, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what happened in those woods near Hollow Mountain. It started like any other week. Reports were coming in about strange lights near the cliffs flickering like fireflies, except these didn't move like anything natural. A couple of hikers swore they'd lost hours of time out there, like their brains had just blanked. Most of us brushed it off as campfire tales or too much whiskey, but there was this. nagging feeling in my gut that wouldn't quit. To make things worse, a local mining company had recently reopened some abandoned shafts near those cliffs. Big mistake. Folks around here always said Hollow Mountain was cursed. And even though I'm not much for superstitions, the timing felt all wrong. The boss partnered me with Danny, that weak new kid, barely out of training. He had all the enthusiasm you'd expect from someone his age, plus a streak of recklessness I didn't care for. We were complete opposites. I liked staying cautious. He couldn't wait to dive headfirst into trouble. Danny and I were supposed to check out those cliffs and make sure the mining crew hadn't disturbed anything dangerous. It sounded routine. A simple hike, maybe clear up some rumors, and call it a day. But from the moment we set foot near Hollow Mountain, nothing felt simple. Nothing at all. The hike started like any other. The sun was just dipping behind the trees, and the air was still. Too still. Normally, you'd hear birds or the rustling of leaves, maybe a squirrel darting across the trail. But that day, silence. Nothing but the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt. Danny was walking ahead of me, swinging his flashlight like a kid showing off a new toy. "You ever see anything weird out here, Jack?" he asked, grinning. "Weird, sure," I replied. "But not in the way you're thinking. What about the lights people talked about? You believe them?" I didn't answer right away. Truthfully, I didn't know what to believe, and I wasn't about to spook the kid with my own uneasy thoughts. "People see what they want to see," I said, keeping my voice steady. About a mile in, the trail got rougher, leading us closer to the cliffs. Granite towers jutted out of the earth like jagged teeth, their faces blackened from centuries of wind and rain. That's when the smell hit us. It was faint at first, like something had been left to rot deep in the woods. Not quite an animal, though. It was sharper, almost metallic, like blood mixed with wet rocks. "Smell that?" Danny asked, wrinkling his nose. "Yeah." "Stay close," I told him. Feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up, we pressed on, shining our flashlights into every shadow. After about 10 minutes, we found something, the first real sign that something was wrong. A bright yellow helmet, scuffed and smeared with what looked like dried blood, was lying at the base of the cliffs. Danny picked it up. "Looks like one of the miners' helmets. Think he got hurt?" "Put it down," I said quickly. "And don't touch anything else." The cliffs loomed overhead, massive slabs of stone that seemed to hum in the twilight. I glanced up and froze. High above, maybe 30 or 40 feet, claw marks raked down the sheer face of the rock. Long, jagged streaks, like something with impossibly large hands had been climbing. Danny followed my gaze and let out a nervous laugh. "What? What could even do that? A bear?" "Bears don't climb granite, kid," I said. My voice came out more gruff than I intended. "Stay sharp, and don't wander off." The silence pressed in tighter the deeper we went. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, echoing against the walls of the cliffside trail. My instincts were screaming at me, but I couldn't say why. I just knew we weren't alone out there. Then we heard it. A faint clicking sound, like someone tapping stones together. It echoed faintly from somewhere up ahead, soft and rhythmic, like a call. "What's that?" Danny whispered, his voice shaky now. I held up my hand to stop him and listened. The clicking wasn't natural, it was too deliberate, too steady. Then it stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. "Stay close," I whispered. We rounded a bend in the trail and spotted something in the distance. A narrow cave opening yawned in the face of the cliffs, its edges smooth and unnatural. The dark space inside seemed to suck in the light from our flashlights, making it impossible to see how deep it went. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, to get out of there and call in reinforcements. But before I could speak, Danny took a step forward. "Jack, look at the ground," he whispered. I shone my flashlight down. The dirt at the entrance of the cave was scattered with more claw marks, deep grooves like something had been crawling in and out. But worse than that were the footprints. They were human. Bare feet, maybe 3 or 4 pairs of them, leading into the darkness. But the size wasn't right, too narrow, too long, like someone had stretched a person's feet out and left something wrong. "Let's turn back," I said firmly. "Now." Danny didn't argue, but as we started to move away, that clicking sound started again. This time it was louder, sharper, and closer. We both froze, flashlights darting around. I could feel it, something was watching us. And whatever it was, it didn't want us to leave. The clicking grew louder. It wasn't coming from one spot anymore, it echoed all around us, bouncing off the cliffs. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and that made my skin crawl. "Stay behind me," I told Danny, pulling out my pistol. I didn't draw my gun much on the job, but I wasn't taking chances now. Danny nodded, his face pale in the beam of his flashlight. His hand shook a little as he pointed it toward the cave. "You think it's an animal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. Whatever it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. The clicking stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear anything at all, but the woods were dead quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Something moved at the edge of the cave. Just a shadow at first, sliding along the wall, almost too fast to notice. Danny saw it too, and his breath hitched. "Jack." "What was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, it stepped out into the open. The flashlight caught it full on. At first, it looked like a person, hunched, with long arms hanging at its sides. But the longer you looked, the more wrong it became. Its limbs were too long, stretched out like rubber bands. Its head was smooth and pale, with hollow black pits where its eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe, it just stood there, staring at us. "Back away." "Slow," I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. Danny didn't move. His flashlight was shaking so bad I could hear the batteries rattling inside. The thing cocked its head at us, like it was studying us, and then its mouth opened. No lips, just a wide, gaping hole that stretched too far across its face. It made a wet, clicking noise, louder now, echoing off the cliffs like someone snapping twigs underwater. And then it moved. It flowed up the cliffside, its long limbs stretching out unnaturally, sticking to the rock like glue. There wasn't a single sound from its movements. No scrape, no shuffle, just this awful, impossible silence. I grabbed Danny's arm, snapping him out of his trance. "Go!" I barked, shoving him back toward the trail. We ran. God, did we run. I'm not a young man, but in that moment, I didn't care about the burn in my legs or the weight of my pack. I could feel it chasing us, skittering along the rocks above, shadowing our every step. Danny stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. I turned to grab him, but before I could, the thing dropped from the cliff. It hit the ground without a sound and straightened up, blocking our path. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was pale and tight, stretched too thin over jagged bones. Its arms hung past its knees, the fingers long and twisted, tipped with black, claw-like nails. I raised my gun. My hand shook, but I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the quiet woods, the flash lighting up the thing's hollow face. It staggered, but only for a moment. Then its body seemed to twist, stretching unnaturally, dodging to the side like it didn't have bones. It moved too fast, too smooth, circling us with jerky, spider-like motions. "Run!" I shouted, firing again to keep it back. Danny didn't need telling twice. He grabbed his flashlight and bolted, and I followed, firing blindly behind us as we sprinted down the trail. I didn't know if I was hitting it, and I didn't stop to check. When we finally burst out onto a wider path, the clicking stopped. I turned, aiming my flashlight into the trees, but the thing was gone. The woods were silent again, except for our gasping breaths. Danny collapsed against a tree, clutching his knees. "What?" The hell was that? He wheezed. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with us. After a few minutes of catching our breath, I pulled Danny up and said, "We're not safe here. Keep moving." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "What was that thing, Jack?" His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. "That wasn't an animal. That wasn't anything normal." I didn't have the heart to argue with him. He was right. The trail split a few hundred feet ahead, one side leading back toward the ranger station, the other toward the abandoned mining area. Something told me we needed to figure out what was happening before heading back. If these things were crawling out of Hollow Mountain, there had to be a reason, and it wasn't going to stop just because we ran. "We're going to the mines," I told Danny, stepping onto the left path. He looked at me like I was insane. "Are you serious? We almost died back there, and you want to go toward them?" I placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking low and firm. "Listen, Danny, that thing isn't going away. If we don't figure this out, it's only going to get worse. And someone's got to stop it, understand?" His jaw clenched, but after a moment he nodded. The path to the mine felt endless. The smell hit us first stronger now, sour and metallic, like decaying meat mixed with rust. It clung to the air, getting worse the closer we got. Danny gagged, pulling his jacket over his nose. "God, that's awful." "You think it's the miners?" I didn't answer. We reached the clearing, where the old mine entrance sat wedged in the mountain like an open wound. It was wider than I expected, ringed with rusted metal supports and caution signs that looked like they hadn't been replaced in decades. The stench was overpowering now, and my flashlight barely cut through the heavy shadows spilling out of the tunnel. The air coming from inside felt colder than it should have been, almost clammy, like standing too close to a freezer full of spoiled meat. Something glinted on the ground near the entrance, and Danny picked it up, a torn piece of fabric, smeared with something dark and dried. He held it out to me. "Is this blood?" I nodded, my stomach nodding. "Could be." We stepped inside. The light from the entrance faded fast, swallowed by the blackness of the tunnel. Our flashlights wobbled over the walls, which were slick and glistening, as if they were sweating. A few steps in, we saw the first pile. Bones, human bones, scattered across the ground, stripped clean, some cracked open like whatever had eaten them wanted the marrow. Danny cursed under his breath. I heard his boots scrape the dirt as he froze in place. "Jack, we can't, this is." "Quiet." I cut him off. The last thing we needed was for that clicking noise to start up again. We pressed on, deeper into the mine, and that's when we found the skins. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. They hung from the ceiling in shredded sheets, like macabre curtains. The light from my flashlight passed right through them. Human skin stretched thin, drained of color, hanging in pieces. Danny swore and stumbled back, nearly dropping his light. The shapes weren't random. They were hung purposefully, arranged almost, carefully, like something was learning. "They're wearing them, aren't they?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. "Those things are trying to be human." My stomach turned as the thought hit me. The tracks outside the cave, the warped footprints, they weren't from humans. They were from those things wearing human skin, trying to move like us, mimic us. "They're evolving," I muttered, barely loud enough to hear myself. Danny stared at me, wide-eyed. "Evolving? Jack, what does that even mean?" "It means they need us to finish whatever they're doing," I said grimly. "They're using people feeding on them, taking their skin sand. Something tells me they're not done." Before he could reply, we heard it. The clicking. This time, it was all around us, echoing off the walls of the mine, loud enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. Danny spun around, his flashlight darting wildly. "Jack, they're here," he whispered. "Run," I said, my voice low and steady, keeping the panic buried deep. Back to the entrance. Now. We turned. moving as fast as we could without tripping over the bones. The clicking followed us, louder now, overlapping more than one. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Crawlers, a dozen or more, crawling down the walls and ceiling of the mine, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their hollow faces locked onto us. We weren't going to make it out if they caught us, and I knew it. We ran. My legs burned with every step, but the sound of those crawlers behind us clicking, skittering, scraping kept me going. Danny was right on my heels, gasping for air, his flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The entrance wasn't far now. I could see a faint sliver of light up ahead, just enough to give me hope, but the crawlers were faster. I heard the first one drop from the ceiling behind us, landing with a dull thud. Danny screamed, and I whipped around, shining my flashlight on the thing. It was bigger than the one we'd seen earlier. Its limbs were longer, stretched grotesquely thin, and its skin had an awful sheen to it, almost like it was wet. It didn't pause this time. It charged, its limbs unfolding like a spider's, moving so fast it barely seemed real. "Danny, keep going!" I shouted, firing my gun. The noise echoed through the tunnel, deafening, but the crawler barely flinched. Danny stumbled, tripping over a pile of bones. He hit the ground hard, his flashlight rolling out of reach. "Jack, help!" I didn't think I just acted. I lunged for him, grabbing his arm and hauling him to his feet. "Go! Move!" But it was too late. The crawlers were on us. One of them shot out an arm longer than it should have been and grabbed Danny by the leg. The claws tore through his jeans like paper, dragging him down. "No!" Danny screamed, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. I grabbed his arm, pulling with everything I had, but the thing was too strong. More crawlers swarmed forward, their clicking growing louder, filling the tunnel like a swarm of insects. One of them reached out, its claw slicing across Danny's face, leaving a deep gash that sprayed blood across the wall. I fired again and again, but it didn't matter. The crawlers didn't stop. "Jack!" Danny cried, his voice cracking. "Don't let them." He never finished. The crawler yanked him out of my grip, and he disappeared into the darkness. His screams echoed down the tunnel, cutting through me like a knife. I stood there, frozen, flashlight trembling in my hand, staring into the blackness where Danny had been. The clicking slowly faded, swallowed by the deep, awful silence. For a second, I thought about going after him, but I knew it was pointless. Danny was gone, and if I stayed, I would be too. I stumbled back toward the entrance, my legs shaking, my mind racing. The crawlers didn't follow. Maybe they'd gotten what they wanted, or maybe they were saving me for later. When I finally burst out of the mine and into the cold night air, I fell to my knees, gasping, shaking, covered in sweat and Danny's blood. I couldn't move, couldn't think, but as I sat there, staring back at the mine, I knew one thing. I had to stop them. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the dark mouth of the mine. My chest heaved, but I barely felt the cold night air. Danny's screams echoed in my head, over and over. He was gone, and deep down, I knew there was no saving him or anyone else those things got their hands on. But I couldn't walk away. Something was waking in that mountain, something worse than the crawlers themselves. If they'd been hibernating all this time, then whatever woke them wasn't done stirring them up. More people would come. More would disappear. And the thought of anyone else ending up like Danny turned my fear into something sharper. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead, but I grabbed my flashlight and made my way back to the ranger station, my mind set on one thing: blowing that mine to hell. Back at the station, I found the dynamite. The old mining company had stored crates of the stuff when the operation shut down years ago, claiming they'd come back for it. They never did. Lucky for me, it was still there in the supply shed, coated in dust but intact. I packed everything I could carry into my bag dynamite: fuses, and a heavy-duty lighter. My hands shook as I worked, not from fear but from the weight of what I was about to do. I left a note on my desk. I didn't write much, just enough so that whoever found it would know what happened. No details, though. Nobody would believe me, and I didn't want them to come looking. They just needed to stay the hell away from Hollow Mountain. The walk back to the mine was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had my nerves on edge. I kept expecting the crawlers to come out of the dark and drag me away, but they didn't. When I reached the entrance, I stopped to listen. The clicking was faint now, coming from deep inside the mine, like the creatures had retreated further underground. My gut told me this was my one chance to stop them before they came out again. I lit my flashlight and stepped in. The air inside was colder than before, thicker somehow, like the mine itself was breathing. My boots crunched over the scattered bones as I made my way deeper. It wasn't long before I reached the spot where Danny had fallen. His flashlight lay smashed on the ground, surrounded by blood and torn fabric. My stomach churned, but I kept moving. Further in, I found what I was looking for, the main chamber. The space opened up into a massive cavern, its walls covered in scratches and strange markings that didn't look natural. The skins were everywhere, hanging in shredded curtains, some even stitched together like macabre mosaics. In the center of the chamber was a pit, a black void that seemed to hum with a low vibration, almost like it was alive. And they were there. The crawlers lined the walls and ceiling, clinging to the stone, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Dozens of them, maybe more. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the dynamite from my bag, working as fast as my shaking hands would allow. I lined the pit with sticks of explosives, securing the fuses and lighting them one by one. The hiss of the fuses echoed in the cavern, and the crawlers began to move. They clicked louder now, a horrible, frantic noise like they understood what I was doing. One of them dropped down in front of me, its limbs elongating as it rose to its full, impossible height. It lunged, and I stumbled back, firing my pistol until the chamber was empty. The bullet slowed it, but they didn't stop it. It swiped at me, its claws grazing my arm, but I didn't let go of the lighter. The last fuse sparked to life, and I turned to run. But the crawlers were too fast. Another one grabbed my leg, dragging me to the ground. Its claws sank into my skin, tearing through my pants as I kicked and screamed. More of them closed in, their clicks deafening now, their hollow faces inches from mine. This was it. I glanced back at the sparking fuses and did the only thing I could. I reached into my bag, grabbed a stick of dynamite I hadn't placed, and lit it. The crawlers froze for a second, their heads cocking in eerie unison as they stared at the burning fuse in my hand. "Come and get me," I growled. And then everything went white. When I opened my eyes, I was outside. The entrance to the mine was gone, replaced by a pile of rubble and thick, choking dust. My ears rang, and every part of me ached, but I was alive. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe the blast threw me clear, or maybe the mountain took pity on me. Either way, the crawlers were buried deep, sealed behind tons of rock. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the mountain. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving Hollow Mountain behind for good. Some nights, though, I still hear the clicking. It's been years since that night. I never went back to Hollow Mountain, not even once. Officially, the place is off-limits, now a hazardous area, according to the posted signs. Every so often, hikers or locals will ask why. But the story they get is simple. Unstable ground, risk of collapse. No one questions it much, but I know the truth. The nights after the explosion were the hardest. I'd sit awake in my cabin, staring at the mountains in the distance, half expecting to see the faint glow of those strange lights again. My body healed slowly, but my mind didn't. The faces of those crawlers, hollow and lifeless, still haunt me. And Danny, I don't let myself think too long about him. I left the job not long after. Retirement was coming anyway, but the mountain took whatever was left of me. I couldn't walk those woods anymore without thinking of what was buried beneath them. At first, I stayed close. I'd hear rumors, people claiming they saw shadows by the cliffs at night or felt something watching them while hiking. Nobody took it seriously, of course, and the stories were always vague. But they kept me on edge, kept me wondering if I'd really stopped it. For a while, I thought about telling someone the truth. Maybe some agency or research group could deal with whatever's still in that mine. But who would believe me? And what if digging it up again woke something worse? No, it's better this way. The world doesn't need to know what's in that mountain. Some secrets are better left buried. Now, I live far from the woods, in a small town where nothing ever happens. Most days are quiet, peaceful. But every now and then, late at night, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can hear it again. That faint clicking sound. It's probably nothing. I tell myself that over and over. But just in case, I keep my flashlight on the nightstand, and I don't go near the mountains anymore.